Well, welcome everybody. Long-time listener, first-time caller. Okay, now I think we can actually get started now that we have a microphone going. Welcome to the Global Street Fight. I'm Steve Halsey with Gibbs Soell. I run our business consulting practice, which is really focused on looking at the intersection of business and brand strategies and really how we can move the needle. And I'm really pleased to have here with me today my good friend Robert Fronk, who heads up the reputation management and public affairs practice for Nielsen. So we're going to talk today about something a little bit different than what you've heard in the last two sessions. Those were really all about what do we consume and how do we influence people. What we're going to talk about today is really what are people thinking? And more specifically, what are people thinking about leaders and leadership, and how does that impact us as communicators and what we need to do? And it's kind of interesting because we fielded this year our second annual Global Street Fight study, and we call it Permission to Act, Time to Act. And there's a copy of it on the table, and we'll reference some of those points as we go through today. But it really is looking at the intersection of innovation, boldness, and trust in our leaders, and what does that require us as communication professionals, as professional strategists to do. And we find this interesting conundrum that I'm going to talk to Robert about. Luke started out by really talking about this notion of renewed optimism. And why wouldn't we be optimistic, right? Generally speaking, the stock market is up. Unemployment, for the first time in a while, has actually gotten above pre-recession level. Corporate profits are definitely higher than they've been for a while. And things seem pretty good. There's a renewed optimism out there, except apparently when it comes to talking about leaders and our leadership. And so that's what we wanted to spend some time talking about here today, was just the state of corporate leadership and the fact, Robert, maybe you can explain to us, why is the state of corporate leadership generally seen as weaker now than 5 years ago in the depths of the recession?
So think back to 2008 and 2009 and the notion that today the American public actually doesn't believe leadership is any stronger than it was then. And I can tell you from a number of studies and things that we did back then, that was the low point. And yet, as Steve said, we were out just literally last week and worked with just over 2,000 members of the U.S. general population and asked them some of the same questions we've been asking over time. And there's a 25% drop in those that think leadership is stronger today in large companies than it was just 5 years ago. Now, interestingly, what we really have, though, is a gigantic middle where people are not sure, right? And so I know, Steve, you said we're going to take a different topic, but I actually think our topic is completely related to the two that we just heard. And I've got a few notes, and hopefully in our time we can look at this. But one thing that jumped out at me was this notion of Gen Y and how they look at things. And this notion of I thought it was fascinating that Evan started by saying there's this perception that they gaze at their navels and they're self-absorbed and all of these different things. We know from other work that we do that about 6 in 10 Americans now actually go and research a company's behavior, what they do as a corporation before they're willing to buy and engage with their public. For Gen Y, that number is over 75%. 3/4 want to understand what a company believes, what their values are, and how they behave in the world before they're willing to actually look at your products and services. And so I think there's some pretty big overlap between these things. But back to that conundrum question, what we're seeing is that, again, they believe that leadership is not any stronger. They're saying they want both boldness, a right balance of boldness and risk-taking, and risk management in leaders. But what's missing from their perspective is the notion of strategic planning, right? So there's boldness for boldness' sake. There's risk-taking because I need to sort of juice my numbers, because the preponderance are saying what our leadership is all about today is strictly their own short-term goals to maximize what they need to get done. And the other thing that I thought when Mark was up here earlier, he mentioned that 2/3 of all ad dollars are now directed at literally returning the sale right at that moment. It's fascinating to me that we've moved to a place where all of our dollars are spent on make the sale now, yet we talk about brand building, we talk about curating, we talk about all these things, and then, but at the end of the day, anybody is looking at is today's sales dollars and these quarterly numbers. And what the public, I think, is saying at large is they're looking for leadership to think beyond. Because quite frankly, it was some of that short-term thinking that got us in the mess we were in back in 2008 and 2009.
So you talk about this notion of the public wanting leaders to look beyond, and I had a little fun by putting a couple of questions up here that I wanted to explore that I think get to back, again, this conundrum that we're seeing about really who are the leaders that we're going to move forward. Because one of the interesting things in this year's study was things got a lot better than last year's study. And we had asked the question, when you look at the main priority of a CEO, should it be to be bold and innovative to move the company forward, or is it more to manage risk and get more of that consistency in performance? And my assumption going into this was that the market's doing better, the economy's doing better, people are going to want their leaders to be even bolder. What we've seen this year, though, was a shift a little bit different, a shift towards consistency, a shift towards safety. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, so we don't have the ability to qualitatively go and ask all the whys. What I would say, though, is that notion of consistency is different than safety. When they're looking at risk management and consistency, I think they're saying grow, but don't grow in a way that puts us on the roller coaster path we've been on for the last 5 years. So I want you to be bold, I want you to be innovative, but I don't want you to do it in a way that may lead to these 30% gyrations in how your business performs, in share price, in products that don't meet safety standards. So I think consistency and risk management has taken on a new meaning, and I think that meaning actually still is to be bold and dynamic, but to do it in a way that actually does ensure a longer term growth, both for the business and for my relationship with you.
So I wanted to get your reaction to something. Harvard Business Review last fall did a special where they were really looking at leadership, and this was what they talked about in terms of the big gap. They said senior leaders are incentivized to focus on short-term financial results at the expense of long-term performance. If they don't make their quarterly numbers, their compensation and jobs are in danger. So without equally strong pressure for longer-term thinking, things will likely stay the same, and that is the fundamental problem with leadership today. What is your take on that?
Amen. Fundamentally, that is part of the problem. And I think, in other research we've done, most would argue that they are not getting dinged if they don't even make their short-term numbers, right? That the deck has been stacked to make it work one way or the other. Can they lose their jobs? Of course. But I think this notion of leadership being about something broader than just making the numbers is missing from the public's perspective. I'm not being the judge here. Someone asked a question earlier today, the whole plumber conversation that we had. And to me, the fascinating answer to your question, and it ties right into this, is that we are seeing the companies that are considered successful today, and by successful, meeting high employee engagement, tremendous sense of satisfaction from customers and all of the other stakeholders they need to deal with, are those who fundamentally figured out how to talk about their social role, which is very, very different from corporate social responsibility, because someone over here also asked a question of, people think I'm pandering. When you're actually talking about your business in the context of the value that it brings to a broader swath of people than just your customers versus having CSR programs, you're talking about your company in a different way. And to your plumbing question, defining what that social role is, even if it's not one that's known to the public, but picking the audiences who need to understand that social role is the answer to your question about how to get the kind of coverage you want. You may not need coverage with the general media, but instead, if you can define your social role, and if that social role is mitigating the risk gyrations of the market, if that social role is preventing rogue traders from losing $6 billion of their corporate or clients' money, you've got a story to tell that doesn't have to be about financial service products. And I'm making that up. I don't know exactly what that role is. But that Harvard quote, I think, is dead on. And we're seeing a movement towards changing compensation. And I actually believe that Gen Y is going to be the ultimate catalyst for changing the compensation models of companies when we look out about 5 or 10 years.
So you were talking a lot about social role, and I do want to cover that in a minute because I also do think we've got the ability that I'd like to have you share a little bit about this notion of the opinion elites, the global opinion elites that you've come up with. And basically my dumbed down definition of it is that those are the individuals who are very active in traditional and social media and a lot of the things that we talked about this morning, but who want to engage in the conversation. But when we asked them this year really to look at senior leadership, and are they focused more on short-term, long-term, or somewhere in the middle, I was surprised by the inverse of the numbers, that the opinion elite, those who are most active in the conversation, 54% of them say that today's leaders are more focused on the short term than 5 years ago when we were in the depth of the recession. And inversely, of the rest of the public, 54% of them say that things are about right. So Robert, I'd be interested in a couple of things. What are the implications of the opinion elite? And then what do communicators need to think about? So should we just communicate to the opinion elite, to both? Do we have dual strategies? How does that play out?
Yeah, so there might be dual strategies in terms of the where, but I actually don't think there should be dual strategies in terms of, this gets back to the pandering. You don't want to be creating messages for some subset of one audience, right? The opinion elite are who they are because they consume media at a vastly higher rate than the general public at large. They have a higher knowledge of business issues and social issues, and those can be national in their community, it depends. And then most importantly, they actually do something about it. So they are the folks who either are authoring a blog, they are still, and I know this is going to sound dated to some here, they're still writing letters to the editor. They are calling in to talk shows. They're doing a whole bunch of things. So they're more knowledgeable, and then they're doing something about it, which is why we call them the elites. But if you don't have a strategy to target and speak to these folks in a way and recognize that they are more engaged and more knowledgeable, then you're fundamentally missing the chance to have a megaphone for the communications that you're trying to put forth.
So when we think about this as communicators, then what you're saying is that the missing link really is strategy and clearly articulating what that strategy is. So is strategy really the missing link?
Well, in the work we've done, we know strategic planning is the number one thing that folks are looking for from leadership, and it's the number one thing that's missing. And again, I think there's that combination. It gets back to meeting those short-term numbers, but the notion of strategic planning is not there. You know, I'm fortunate enough in the role in leading our consulting practice to get to speak with, with the C-suite audiences in a number of companies throughout the year. And I am fascinated that the first thing I'm asked, right, and I specialize on the subject of corporate reputation, which those of you may have heard me speak before. Reputation is the most unique thing about yourself, right? It's who you are, it's your DNA and every experience you've had. And yet and the same is true for a corporation. It's all about your history, your people. And yet the first question I get from anybody with a C title, are there some norms? Are there some best practices? What are the one or two things that everybody else is doing that I can do so that my reputation can be good enough too? So you have this unbelievably personal thing and a chance to differentiate yourself in a way that is really authentic, and yet the first thing that people want to know is, what are the norms? And what's everyone else doing so I can just mimic that? And so I kiddingly said to you this morning, we've moved from this notion of strategic planning to strategic mimicry. And it's both in what we want to do in terms of this whole best practice thing, but it's also even in the notion, it came up this morning because we were talking, today's Friday, I have heard 60 times this week in meetings that I've been in, the lean in phrase, right? So it's like, what's the book? What are the three things I have to be able to say in every meeting to exhibit leadership versus actually exhibiting leadership? So it's a conundrum.
Yeah, so the conundrum is there's safety following the herd, but that isn't what people want, right?
Well, is following the herd leadership?
I think that's exactly the point in terms of what we're looking at. So as we think about the implication for communicators, then as we think about the need to be genuine or to clearly articulate the strategy, as simple as it sounds, I really do think that that's the key. And from my perspective and from my view of the data, obviously he's much more the expert than I am. But when I look at whether you want to be bold and innovative or like that steady hand on the tiller, personally, I say if it makes a good business strategy, I don't care which way you go. Just be very clear about communicating what you are, because it seems like the worst that you could do is just kind of flop around in the middle.
Yeah, that's great. You know, we had two gentlemen kicked off today's session, Jimmy and Mark, and they are from two organizations who are fundamentally looking to lead, one created new and one leading with a 100-year history and nevertheless seeking out a leadership position. I jotted down some of the words they used, phrases they used to describe their organizations and their journey. Unapologetic about who we are. True believers in the strategic path we're on. Early bets on the things that we thought might make a difference. Those are the terms I think that you're looking for, and I think you're right, Steve. It is less about the notion of, you know, did I get it right? Can I be consistent? Can I be unapologetic about the kind of organization I want to be and the kind of leaders that we're looking for?
Well, I mean, that's refreshing to hear. I mean, one of the things we talk about a lot in our organization is this notion of confident risk-taking, which is picking a direction, picking a thing, and moving for it, but being very definitive in terms of doing that. Now, before we open it up to questions, though, I did want to talk a little bit about, you talked about the opinion elites, and one of the things, and there's a summary copy in there of some of the high points of the opinion elites, but can you talk to me just a little bit about the different expectations in emerging markets versus developing markets as it relates to corporate reputations and kind of this whole notion of genuine communication that we're talking about?
Yeah, so as Steve mentioned, we put a couple of slides out there from a large study we did in 18 countries. And I put it out there actually to reinforce this notion of getting away from best practices, right? Because the data suggests that you have to, and again, I think it was Evan who talked so much about context. Context is critical in the notion of leadership and strategic decision making, and understanding that what's required of me, what the expectations are for me as an organization and a leader are very different in emerging markets and in developed markets, but more importantly, what drives business success is different as well. And we put those slides out there to show you the example that we can say these things in general about the 18 countries, but then we picked 3 nearly identical companies and did a driver analysis to say what drives their reputation specifically, and if you take a look at it, they're on your table. There are a couple of overlapping things, but there are 6 very different things in all of them. So you run that risk, again, of only looking at the snapshot, but ignoring context, and again, ignoring leadership is about defining how to not follow the herd, but how to think about a different path to get there.
So I want to open it up for questions. We've got data, we've got research, we're certainly not shy on perspective, and you've got one of the world's most renowned reputation experts here. So who would like to ask the first question?
I have another question. Tara with SAP again. We are authentically committed to promoting early talent in our workforce, meaning Generation Y, because it's what makes sense for our business and for our future growth. It's just smart to do. Do you have any insight on the perception of Gen Y in leadership roles that you can share with us, and how that might be changing perceptions of the public as it relates to some of the other things we discussed earlier?
So perceptions of them in leadership roles or how they see leaders?
Them in leadership roles specifically. So for example, Mark Zuckerberg, is there a different trust level that you see with those individuals when you're speaking with the public?
Yeah, so it's again, it's not a one-size-fits-all. You know, Mark Zuckerberg is an interesting because he's got a whole lot of equity in a lot of areas, but he's also got some challenges related to you talk about trust. The trust there is the whole notion of, does his organization, can they be trusted with your personal information, right? And that's where there's a lot of research that show a real dichotomy for Facebook and for him as a whole is this whole question of, I trust what he's doing, But then when you get to the real nitty-gritty about me personally, there's some things there. But more broadly about your question, Gen Y, I believe, is a cohort that is desiring to become leaders more quickly, and with a different perspective. And I believe, though, that they want to take a different approach to it, much like the whole notion of networks and social has been critical, and someone mentioned they were born into a different place. They view leadership the same way. So they see leadership as a collective. And when they think about how they want to make decisions, and they think about what that sort of, again, not following the herd, they want that real strong network consensus behind that before making those moves. So there's just a couple of quick things that we've seen from research we've done in that area.
And we did find some interesting findings when we sliced the data of this year's Global Street Fight study in terms of what they want from data, what they want from leaders is that those that are younger want leaders to be much bolder in their direction. But the other thing that was kind of interesting, and Robert, I'm sure I'm going to forget some of these, while strategic leader, bar none, across all age categories was the #1 thing that people associated with bold leadership, when you sliced it by age, you got things with the Generation Y that you didn't get with other groups, which was notions of being confrontational and really standing for something and sticking for those points that we didn't see as the other. And I'm sure I missed some of those attributes, but I was really surprised that one of the things they said they were really looking for is a leader who's willing to be controversial. That my interpretation of that is that's somebody who's standing for somebody.
Yeah, and by the way, Mary, you can confirm this. I think all the detail of the study will be available for download, so you can look at all of those different demographic cuts.
So questions? This side of the room's way too quiet. We had our great plumbing question earlier. Anybody else want to stir the pot? Matt?
Uh-oh.
At Quinn, at Columbia Business School, just question, reputation. We've talked a lot about sort of, I'll give an example, which is Coca-Cola, which is driving at the same time for double its revenues by 2020, but also being a good social player and changing the world and those kind of things. And I mean, I've got no problem with people drinking a Coke, but it's not necessarily a beneficial thing to our health and wellness to be doubling our Coca-Cola consumption, for example. I have a lot of struggle with companies where finding that balance of growth and sustainability or doing good for the world, where they're sort of in conflict and they don't talk about what they're going to do to change how they're growing to match the social component. I don't know if you guys have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, a couple. So first, I think, again, Evan mentioned it. No one is looking for corporations to fix the world's problems, per se, as a primary. Instead, it's in the business that I'm in. Because sustainability is a great topic. Again, if you have sustainability programs, you may or may not actually be practicing sustainability. Because I think most folks would look at sustainability and say it's the consistent ability to do what I need to do with less in a better way, in a way that changes, what changes can I make to my business, coupled with what does that business do in terms of being able to make the parts of the world that I impact more sustainable. Coke, I'm not an expert on their strategy, but I know diversification for them has been a tremendous area of growth for the last couple of years, and focus. You've got, it's going to be interesting. You've got the two, Coke and Pepsi, right? The two giants, completely different business models right now, and not sure which is going to go. Pepsi is saying our whole business model is about social responsibility and sustainability, but the business performance has been struggling. And you've got Coke saying we're going to build the business so that we can be more socially responsible and sustainable, and so to your point, they want to double revenues. I'm not sure which way it's going to work. What I will say is that what the public wants and what those who consume companies' products say is, I want you to figure out within the context of the business you're in, and we choose or don't choose to drink sugared water, but in the context that you're in, are you doing everything that you can to play a more positive social role? And I think that's the trade-off. Those who want that perfect are not going to get it. And I think Coke does enough things, particularly based on some of the survey information we do and which we publish each year, they hit on enough of the high notes. The product, you can have a product, but it's still a product of choice. Your product cannot be something that's going to change the world, but they would argue, and they have an awful lot of data on this also, that they bring a level of refreshment and vigor and renewed energy into their customers, which that in itself can help those customers change the world. So there's a lot of different ways to look at that.
So anybody else? We have time for a few more stumpers. Is back here?
Hi, Beth Miller. I'm the communications director for Skanska, which is a global construction firm. So we have a lot of challenges, one of which is fighting an industry-wide negative reputation that construction workers and construction projects often have. And I wondered if you had any tips or any insights into what you can do. It's similar to Coca-Cola, I would say, to mitigate those negative industry-wide reputation.
Well, I think the key as we're talking about here is really figuring out what your story that you want to be very consistent in telling that to tie into the strategy that I think is key, because and I think when we think about the panels that we talked about here too, it's also thinking about where you want to communicate and how you want to build out from that point of strength, because you're probably not going to go to the HuffPost and be pitching them those stories unless there's something interesting or unique that you're doing within that area in terms of giving back. So from my perspective, it's figuring out first and foremost, what do you want that core story to be, and then how are you going to start from a very strong place and expand it out. But one of the things I think would be interesting, Robert, to get your perspective, particularly when you think about something like construction and development, is when you look at the opinion elites and their view in developed countries versus emerging. And in developed countries, it's very much about performance and what are you hitting, whereas emerging companies, it's more about how are you being a good corporate citizen and evolving in the culture. That for your example, while your core strategy may be the same, some of the elements of how you implement that may be different based on where you're at in the world.
Yeah, so that is really true. The notion of economic development and growing my community, growing my country in the emerging markets is a dominant driver. Your question is one of my favorite, because our favorite clients are those who are in headwind-challenged industries, but who actually have the ability to separate themselves. To me, that is the most fun reputation work that we do. And the first thing that you want to do is actually, I hate to sound like the carpenter who always recommends a hammer and nails, but there are great research methodologies available to separate which parts of the industry reputation am I contributing to, and which am I immune from, and how do I separate the two, and therefore, how can I tell my story that gets at that? And so I would argue that you want to understand when are you painted with the brush, and when can you put some turpentine on there to wipe that paint off because you've got something else underneath. And right now, I mean, other than perhaps technology, there's not an industry that doesn't have sort of a little bit of a negative paintbrush across the whole thing. There's financial services and energy, all the things we literally need to live are in many ways the most challenged. But if you can be a player inside of those industries that's doing something different, that has got a different approach, again, that context, that's when your reputation can actually become the greatest leverage that you have as an organization.
Absolutely, and I think those the complex industries and complex challenges, I know I can speak as a communications professional, are the most fun ones to figure out. It's a little bit more rewarding figuring out a situation like yours than just marketing a cheesy pizza. No offense to cheesy pizza people. Well, that is our time here today. We have food. We're going to be around here to answer questions, but thank you very much for coming to the Global Street Fight. I think we had a great series of discussions here today, really looking at some cutting-edge media, what they were thinking of. We've got Robert here, so if you've got your reputation questions, please feel free to ask them. And thank you very much for joining us at this second annual Global Street Fight. Thank you very much.
Thank you.